We're here for the Securitization in the City panel. I'm John Whitlow. I'll be chairing the panel today. And I first want to start by thanking the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics for organizing and hosting this event. It's really an honor to be here, and it's particularly an honor to be here with this panel. We have a really outstanding group of just serious radical thinkers and organizers, and I'm really excited to hear what they're gonna say. I think the format or the framework, pardon me, for the panel is going to be as follows. I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists, and then I'm going to talk for just a few minutes and hopefully say a few things that'll frame the discussion. That's aspirational. And then our panelists are going to either come to the mic or remain seated and talk to us for 15 minutes each. And if it looks like I'm checking my iPhone, I'm just timing everybody, so I can't even get email or text down here, so I'm only timing people, okay? So I guess from left to right, we have with us Pete White. Pete is the founder and co-director of the Los Angeles Community Action Network, LA CAN, a grassroots organization led by low-income and homeless persons in LA's downtown Skid Row, which fights for housing and civil rights, healthy food access, women's rights, and violence prevention. We have to Pete's right, Mizue Aizeki, who's an organizer and photographer. She's worked on issues of immigration and enforcement in LA, Arizona, and New York for over 15 years. She currently works at the Immigrant Defense Project, where she fights against the collaboration between police and immigration enforcement and the deportation of those with criminal convictions. Next, we have Christina Heatherton, who's a fellow here at the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. She's been working with social movements for housing and education and against domestic and foreign militarization for the past 10 years. She's also currently working on a book called The Color Line in the Class Struggle, The Radical Roots of the American Century, which we can't wait to read. And next we have Helena Wong. Helena is the executive director of CAV, a Pan-Asian community-based organization that works to build the power of low-income Asian immigrants and refugees in New York City. Most recently, CAV has coordinated recovery efforts for low-income New Yorkers displaced or hit hard by Hurricane Sandy. And I am John Whitlow. I'm a professor at the law school here at CUNY. And before that, I was an attorney at the Urban Justice Center and then Make the Road, New York, where I mostly focused on housing work, working mostly on anti-eviction cases and suing a landlord or two. So I don't know how many of you have hung out with current or former housing attorneys before, but we have a tendency to, as our default option, start talking about cases that we've had, and that can sometimes be exciting and interesting, and it can at other times be incorrigible. So hopefully this will be the former rather than the latter. I was trying to think of a way to really frame the different issues that I think are going to be coming together in the discussion today, and my mind drifted to a housing case I had about 8 years back in the Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood of Brooklyn. A woman came into my office, and she was a resident of a NYCHA building. For those of you who aren't familiar, NYCHA is the New York City Housing Authority. They've been in the news quite a bit lately because of issues stemming from the storm. I guess the kind of quick and dirty facts of my client's case were as follows. She lived in this public housing complex and had been there for about 20 years. She rented her apartment for $200 a month, or sorry, $400-something a month. The rent is pegged to your income. And for those of you who know Bed-Stuy, it's a neighborhood that's going through a really intense period of gentrification. So $400 in Bed-Stuy is really a find. But the building she was living in was really poorly maintained. It had really serious chronic repair issues, including actually some of the issues that have come up in a totally different context as a result of the storm. The elevator would go out. This was 8 years ago, and people on the top floor of the building were without elevator service for days on end. So she's getting evicted. And the reason she's getting evicted is that her son, her adult son, was caught up in a police sweep of the housing complex. And this is something that I think is a pretty common occurrence. We kind of associate it now, I think, in particular with this practice of stop and frisk, which I'm sure we all know about. So when something like this happens, when our son gets charged with some minor offense that I can't remember, there's generally a criminal proceeding that gets brought, and then the housing authority in a separate proceeding moves to evict the tenant, right? So in preparing for the eviction case, and I was only her attorney in the eviction case, I start to look into the criminal case. And I find that the case has been totally withdrawn by the police. Not dismissed, but withdrawn. They had no evidence to go forward with the criminal case. So, I'm a relatively new attorney at the time, and I'm thinking, I know that there's a different standard of review in a criminal case than in a civil case, blah, 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 but no evidence is no evidence, right? So I figure I'm going to go in and kind of schmooze with the NYCHA attorney before the trial, the hearing begins, and tell him that, and he's more than likely going to withdraw. And what he said to me will always stick with me. He first said, I agree with you, but that's not really how we operate here. He said, how we operate is we prosecute these cases to the fullest, and to which I said, well, what does that mean if you don't have any evidence, right? And he said, well, it kind of means the following. It means if we couldn't bring a human witness to testify against your client, we would find a pigeon that was in the courtyard that saw what your client's son had done. And we would subpoena the pigeon. We'd bring the pigeon in. So that's weird. And then he said, and if the pigeon had a heart attack on the way to the hearing, we would get out a defibrillator and resuscitate the pigeon and then bring it in to testify. So just like totally blown away. And that's actually the main thing I remember. And I feel like if anyone is telling a story and there's a pigeon and a defibrillator, the story should probably just end at that point. But the case, we won the case. But I bring it up now, and I thought of it as soon as I was invited to talk on the panel, because I think the case really encapsulates and captures a lot of the ways in which different kind of sharp edges of this neoliberal kind of economic and political project come together and collide in cities. I think on the one hand, you have a significant withdrawal of the state from the provision of key services, particularly in the areas of housing and public benefits. And you could literally see that in the building that my client lived in. The building was, as I suggested, deteriorating. You also see a form of economic development that leads to massive inequality and gentrification of certain zones of the city. And in the case of my client, I think it's safe to say that if she had been evicted from this apartment, she would probably never have been able to, she wouldn't have been able to live in the neighborhood where she had lived for over 20 years. And third, a really significant escalation of aggressive policing that's targeted at those communities that are labeled a threat and considered a threat, particularly communities of color and immigrant communities. And I think you see all of these things really coming together in a really pretty gnarly, awful way. And I think that's really, it's at that collision point that I think our panelists are gonna discuss their work. And I realize I'm kind of leaving on my portion on a little bit of a bleak note, but I'm really excited to hear about the work that our panelists are all doing to really try to organize against some of these currents and create something that's, I think, better, economically, racially just, and also that gets concrete gains for poor people and marginalized people in the process. So without further ado, I'll introduce or invite Pete to the podium.
Sounds good. So I'll try not to be bleak, but I don't know if that's going to be possible. I will also attempt to end on a high note. My name is Pete White with the Los Angeles Community Action Network, based in downtown Los Angeles, in a spot called Skid Row. I think, though, before I start my comments, it's important to do some social housekeeping. The first bit of social housekeeping that I must do is to raise a phrase used by Angela Mailu when she says that there is nothing of note done by one person, never has been, never will be. And so while I stand on the stage today, I stand on the stage as an individual carrying the message and the weight of the activities on the ground of an entire community of downtown Los Angeles and South Central Los Angeles, as well as nationally and internationally, as well as those on this panel. Frontline fighters interested in that elusive thing called justice and equity. I think the other thing that is important as I get into my 15 minutes, and trust me, look at me, slide me papers, do whatever you need to do, because I will go long if you don't do that. So I'm gonna look your way every once in a while, and it's all good. But I think it's also important for us to, when I make my comments, for us to understand sort of a common language or a common framework. So I'm going to talk about things like community organizing and campaigns and strategies, but I'm going to attempt to lay out sort of the hood-based, I'm going to call it hood-based, dictionary for that. So when I hit those spaces, we are all in one accord. Is that okay? I heard like 2 people in the room, and there's more than 2. Is that okay with folks? All right, thank you. And so when I talk about community organizing today, I will be talking about a process of building organizations from impacted people that empower the will and spirit of those individuals determined for freedom and justice. I'm talking about building organizations and institutions to fight back against rogue institutions, much more than a protest. I'll talk about the core components of the work that we do: base building, building the power. We might not have the land, and we occupy the land and we're not going anywhere. Let me be very clear about that. And we might not have the deep pockets or the resources of the other side, but what we do have is people power. And so to continue to build that base of individuals that can fight back against rogue capital and fight back against the land barons. I'll talk about campaign development. We'll talk about organizational development, which is key, which is core. We are intentionally building institutions to fight back against the rogue state, to fight back against Wall Street, to build the capacity of those giants within our communities. For us, it's important, for me, it's important for you to note, our organizers and our leaders come from the communities in which we organize. We are not transporting, we are not bringing people from outside who have not experienced the things that we are facing. And those things we'll talk about today is the police state and the security state in Los Angeles, which is very much similar to, as I think, so goes South Africa, so goes Los Angeles and the South Bronx, and anywhere else across the globe. And then lastly, I'll just quickly talk about some of the strategies that we use before I get into the actual story. And so some of the strategies that we use to do this work. Of course, we have a robust community education component. And as part of our community education component, of course, we have a community-based newspaper, which I would proudly say that the LA Times and others have used as first sources. We broke some crazy stories first, and it was quite interesting because for us, reading the mainstream portrayal of our communities was not an option, was not an option we were willing to take. We've also, with Christina, well, now it's Dr. Heatherton, we've created other tools, community-based readers that are being taught in universities across the country. We believe that the other side does a great job at exporting their models of gentrification, their models of the police state, their models of pushing us back, beating us up. We don't do such a great job of exporting the models that we have within our communities that work. And so as part of our community education, we've begun to develop the tools, to develop new counter-narratives, to begin to influence sort of the discourse that happens within the walls of academies such as CUNY, because there is another narrative. And then quickly, the last couple of things that we use for the purposes of this conversation is a robust sort of strategy around grassroots policy development that is generated from the grassroots, community-based research, and community lawyering. And we do a lot of work with our housing lawyer partners, because for us, at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day, we are very clear that we are not going anywhere. We're very clear when we think about gentrification and, and in all of its forms, that once they get you off the land, you ain't never going back. Once they move you from the land that is rightfully yours, you are never going back. And so that is where we start our fight. That is where we start our battle. That is where we draw our lines, our proverbial lines in the sand, saying we are going nowhere. So the story I'm going to tell today is a story of downtown Los Angeles gentrification. And it's quite interesting. As I started, I talked about the exportation of models of gentrification. In downtown Los Angeles, our power brokers, and it is important to note our power brokers, when you think about Los Angeles, many will say it is a progressive place with progressive leadership. And I would say to you, something else ran through my mind that I would say. I would say that that is, in fact, not the case. And so, yes, we have a mayor that comes out of the union movement organizing. We have city council folks who have deep social ties and grassroots links. But based on their policies, you would never know that, because those things are not heir apparent any longer. And so they traveled here to New York, because they felt that the New York model of the Manhattanization of South Los Angeles and downtown Los Angeles would be a great idea. The only thing that was interesting to us, the things that make New York, New York, were not things that they wanted to see in downtown Los Angeles. So street vending was immediately criminalized. Immediately. Like, we don't want that part of New York. We don't want hot dog vendors. That's not the New York we want. Of course, homelessness was immediately criminalized. And it was criminalized using an initiative called the Safer Cities Initiative. Street bodegas, the downtown Los Angeles area has been held together over the last 30 years by Latino store merchants when everyone else fled the city. We don't want any of that. We don't want those bodegas. We're going to criminalize all of those things and all of those spaces. What did criminalization look like? In 2006, in a 50-square block area, and Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa launched what was called the Safer Cities Initiative. Now, when you're from the neighborhood, anytime you hear stuff like the war on drugs, the war on poverty, the Safer Cities Initiative, you immediately go or transport to this idea of safer for whom? Because the drug war has not made me any safer. The war on poverty has not made me any richer. And the social conditions still exist. And so when they came out with this proposition that they would launch 116 police officers in a 20 to 40 square block area in downtown Los Angeles, we knew trouble was brewing. It was a bit of an irony. It is very important for folks to understand when we think about social change work, it is not the HBO version of social change work. The HBO version that would have you believe that the civil rights movement took a couple of years to be over and it was done, not realizing that it was, from the 30s on and well beyond into the 60s, that the actual period of time that it took to make some measure of advance. And so for us, the story that I'm telling you today is a decades-long story. And so prior to the launch of the Safer Cities Initiative, community residents fought back against a gentrification plan that called for the removal of 3,000 to 5,000 housing units in downtown Los Angeles. The Central Area Plan would have you believe that poor people did not exist, a community was not there, and that those weren't permanent dwellings. Folks in the community fought back against it using community organizing and planning tools, and we were able to secure a range of victories that ensured we remained on the land, that ensured we would not be banished. People talk about displacement. Displacement to me seems to suggest that there might be somewhere else that you can go. However, when you're in the West Coast, the only place that you can go if you continue to push west is into the Pacific Ocean. So we say banished from everywhere. We don't talk in terms of displacement. We understand that there is permanence. Interestingly enough, after that 10-year battle, after residents mustered up the strength, the will, and the ability to push back against the state, the judicial system, and our rogue policymakers and developers, we had a sigh of relief, or we thought it was a sigh of relief. We said we have retained the right to remain. That sigh lasted 2 weeks. 2 weeks. Because 2 weeks later, Chief Bill Bratton, also a transplant from your guys' neck of the woods, shows up in LA and conducts a meeting with Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa when he calls together partners. They called me in the room. I have no idea why they thought I was their partner, but they called me in the room to sort of lay out the game plan. And the game plan they laid out was, okay, these community folks, and this is, just to defer for a second, it's like we have the security state and the intelligence state, but I would think they would have had enough intelligence not to have some of the folks in the room like myself to lay out this master plan for the destruction of our community by way of police force. Nonetheless, they did just that. Police Bratton and Dr. What's his name? Kelling. There we go. There it is. George Kelling, who was being paid $500,000 annually to consult on the displacement of an entire community, said the following. He said that in order for us to change the nature of this community, in order for us to move people out of this community, we have got to gain the moral high ground. We have got to get the media on our side. We have got to get the bloggers on our side. It is imperative that people fall on our side and not the other side, meaning the demonization of an entire community so people don't think it is worth saving. And they did just that. And as a result of that, there's a movie called The Soloists and all of these other things. But in addition to that, they launched the Safer Cities Initiative. As I said earlier, 30 to 50 square blocks, 116 extra officers. On the day of the launch, there were 60 officers, and now I'm going to echo the voice of General Dogon, one of our lead community human rights organizers. Imagine 50 officers, 50 to 60 officers, lined up side by side with rubber gloves on their hands, with plastic handcuffs, walking through the community arresting everyone they came in contact with. Imagine that sight in America. This is 2006. Imagine in 2006 that same squadron, because that's what it is. We're talking about military. That same squadron not having enough. Ooh, good Lord. It's all good. Not having enough resources to transport community residents to jail. That they walked African American, largely African American people to jail in coffles, chained together through the streets of downtown Los Angeles, walking to jail, all in the name of progress. And so this idea that the Safer Cities initiative was to make us safe, we knew from the beginning was false. And we knew from the end, I mean, we're still in the battle, is still false. There's a lot more that I'm probably going to have to try and get in questions and answers. I'm sorry, I told you, but thank you for listening.
Wow. I need to know what happened.
Yes, I know. The cliffhanger.
Just when you think the NYPD is the worst, you hear about someone else. Okay. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. All right. It's not easy to be up here. Come on, help me out. So, speaking to the mic. Okay. So my name is Mizue Aizeki, and I work with the Immigrant Defense Project, where we work to defend and expand the rights of people facing deportation with criminal convictions. And I just wanted to get a little feel for who I'm talking to today. So if you work on issues related to immigration, could you raise your hand? And how about people about policing, prisons, empire against the war? All right. Racism, racial justice, social justice. All right. Whoever didn't raise their hand yet, I don't know. Just playing. Okay. So housing. Okay. So what are we talking about? We're talking about an era that we live in right now, which is an era of mass deportation, as I'm sure we are all aware. And I wanted to just get a feel. Does anyone know what the quota is for the U.S. government? How many people they're planning to deport this year? Just shout it out. What? 40. 400,000. That's correct. 400,000 people. Okay, and so if we at any way feel like this is somewhat normal or okay, it's only because of, because it's just become normal over the past 8 years. So in the past 10 years, the U.S. government has deported more people than in the prior recorded history of the United States. Okay, so in the past 10 years, I think we're up to like 3.75. That's more people than have been deported since 1892. And President Obama reigns as the biggest deporter of all time. Sorry, I don't know. I'm kind of PowerPoint inept. How come I can't get, here we go. All right, sorry guys. So, I just wanted to show what happened to my video clip. It's gone. Oh, here it is. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm just going to show a little bit. How is it that the U.S. government is deporting all these people? And so I'm just going to show a little bit of the agency that does the deporting to have them say.
I'm here today to announce the latest results of ICE's national operation targeting criminal aliens for arrest and removal. The operation, known as National Cross-Check, took place last week in every state of the Union, dealing with individuals who've got weapon violations and have got drug convictions. The 2,834 criminals we arrested had convictions for a wide array of offenses, to name a few: murder, rape, aggravated assault, hit and run, grand larceny, sexual assault, DUI, armed robbery, drug trafficking, and child abuse. These are not people we want roaming our streets. The results are impressive. In the space of 6 days, we arrested 3,168 individuals. 698 were immigration fugitives. 559 were illegal reentrants. 50 were gang members. 149 We remove about 400,000 people a year. Due to our changed priorities, however, over of those removals are now criminal offenders, up 89% since fiscal year 2008. 89% in the space of 3 fiscal years. Think about it. The rate of recidivism for criminals released to the streets is as high as 50% in certain parts of our country. When ICE arrests and removes a particular offender, the rate of recidivism for that particular offender drops to 0. Right there. Remove criminal offenders from our streets is good law enforcement, it's good immigration enforcement. Public safety is directly and significantly improved by deporting those involved in crime, period.
Okay, so that's who we are dealing with today. So some key words: criminals, right? Sex offenders, gang members, recidivism. And obviously, as many of you know, the reason why this is so successful is because of the decades of rhetoric and policies around the war on crime and the war on drugs. And you know, I think part of the challenge that we face in the immigrant rights movement is we're fighting, you know, for many different people, right? Some who have some rights, some who have very few rights, right? And I think that this is a moment where a lot of us hear about, you know, this comprehensive immigration reform and the very urgent need for a path to legalization for 12 million people who are undocumented, right? But there are also 12 million people who are documented non-citizens who are deportable for almost any criminal offense. And then anyone else who comes into this system is going to be subject to the same thing. And I think one of the challenges that we face is, you know, immigrant rights groups that have been under siege have adopted the language of "we are not criminals," right? Sensenbrenner said, you know, I'm going to pass a law, which passed the House, which would make your presence here a felony. But this language has endured, and it's serving to kind of separate and undermine what we're fighting for, which is the justice for all people in this country. So I'm just going to talk about that. And so, you know, as we all know, this whole thing about exclusion and expulsion is nothing new in U.S. history. It's part of the foundation of this country, right? Whether you're talking about Native Americans or slaves, Chinese, Japanese. And that also citizens haven't been immune from this either. So we know about the Japanese internment and the so-called Mexican repatriation, which was the mass deportation of 1 million Mexicans in California, mostly over a period of about a decade. 60% of whom were U.S. citizens, right? And so, you know, this language, very typical, consistent with the time, is we're ridding ourselves of enemies. These are not the real Americans. And this is a chart which is showing us here the rate of deportations over the past, 32 years. And so you can see that there's a certain point in time where we come up to a massive spike. And I'm just going to lay out, there's a few things that are playing that are causing, you know, what's getting us to this point that happens in 1996, right? So as I mentioned before, the war on drugs, there's an influx of refugees from Cuba and from Haiti, Central American wars, the rebellion in Los Angeles, and then these measures, punitive measures like Prop 184 and 187. We have the buildup of the border wall with Operation Gatekeeper and NAFTA, et cetera. Then we have 2 bombings that take place, one by an immigrant and one by a native-born Oklahoma City that becomes part of the justification, all this stuff for these laws that happened in 1996. And so why are these laws so critical? One is that it expanded the convictions that trigger deportation. So what happened in 1988 with the Anti-Drug Abuse Act is a new category of crimes was created just for immigrants, which is called aggravated felonies. And the reason why that's so important is because there's no matching in the regular penal law. If you're a non-citizen and you get convicted of a certain crime, which is a misdemeanor, in immigration law, it can be an aggravated felony. And it triggers, and so what happened in 1996 is they added way more categories, and they also took away your right to fight it, right? So prior to that, you might be able to go in front of a judge, present your equities, but that was taken away for all people with aggravated felonies in 1996. So now the foundation is set. You know, a lot of times people talk about it's 9/11, right? It's 9/11, and it actually, In part, it's 9/11, yes, but the foundation was laid way before then, which creates its own challenges here. So yes, 9/11, then what did that do? George Bush, then President Bush, he created the Department of Homeland Security, and so now there's a massive enforcement apparatus that's very well funded, but also it has the political support, right, for the harsh laws. And so we had things that happened like, special registration. All people from certain countries had to register. We had mass sweeps in neighborhoods with high populations of Bangladeshis and Pakistanis, et cetera. And then we had a lot of surveillance that's going on. So here's this context that's growing, and this notion of public safety is really now dominant, right? So one thing I think that's different between Bush and Obama is Bush really talked a lot about terrorism in a way that you don't hear Obama talking about anymore. And so this is part of my narrative, where Bush said, I'm founding this humongous, we need to consolidate, we need massive surveillance, we need to share data on everybody because our country's under siege. The transition that we're experiencing now is, it's more of a frame of public safety, which is very much linked to the war on terror. So what happened post 9/11, kind of the criminal and the terrorist became much more synonymous. And you can see this very much in terms of how gangs are talked about, right? And what else happened after 9/11 is there's a lot more transnational activities. So you have the U.S. Border Patrol training the Border Patrol in Iraq or in the Dominican Republic. You have, they're training the military and the police in El Salvador to fight gangs, and then a tremendous amount of intervention in other countries in the name of, the whole world is America's homeland. Okay, so then we all kind of know what this is. So as the peak in deportation, this is a chart about incarceration in the United States. And so just a few statistics here when we're talking about apparatus and kind of changes and what happened. So this is in 1981. This is how many people were detained by the U.S. government for immigration purposes. 54 people a day. The red dots represent where they're being held. Now on to 2011, we're up to 32,095 people a day. Okay, this is this is the Border Patrol agents from, you can see the big peak. I said post Bill Clinton's Operation Gatekeeper, 1994, and then now we're in a ridiculous amount. And the number of border fencing, see how much it's gone from less than 36 miles to more than 625. And then just very quickly on the DHS budget, I think that says it all. Okay. So, what does this all mean for those of us working here in a city like New York? And one of the main tactics of the ICE right now is to enroll the police in what they call a force multiplier, right? And so they don't have enough resources to get these 400,000 people. We're going to be working more closely with the police. And this is also very much related to the whole security paradigm, right? Because they could be criminals, they could be terrorists, they could be just anybody that might so we all heard about the NYPD with its collaboration with the CIA and the spying on the Muslim communities, and we all hear about, people like Sheriff, do you guys know who that guy is? All right, Sheriff Joe Arpaio, right, from Maricopa County. So he's kind of like the extreme in terms of the most outwardly anti-immigrant, but then now we have the NYPD with, its practices of stop and frisk. And it's a humongous police force, right, now involved in immigration enforcement. So I'm just going to talk, I think one of the primary ways that police are involved across the country in enforcement is sending data to the U.S. government. And so, a lot of times I think we think of people like Sheriff Joe as being kind of the renegade sheriff, I want to get those immigrants. But what ICE is really asking now of police is you don't have to do any of that. Just give us your fingerprints when you book somebody. We're going to check in the database and see if they're deportable. And if they are deportable, then we want you to hold them for us for 48 hours. We're asking you, it's a request, right? And so this is what we're seeing now in New York City, and this is the program that I worked very hard to stop in this state. So I just wanted to show you quickly, this is from this Know Your Rights presentation that we do, so it looks a little funny, but so what does this mean for a non-citizen when you have the Immigration and Customs Enforcement in the criminal justice system, right? So then once you get stopped by the police, they have access to certain databases to see if you're in it, if you're like what they call an absconder, some of the prior deportation order, you might be in there. All right, so then when you get booked at the precinct, your fingerprints get sent to the FBI, and then they send it on to DHS, which is ICE. And then if ICE identifies you as potentially deportable, they're going to issue what's called a hold or detainer, right? So by the time you get to arraignment, the judge will see that ICE is requesting that you get turned over to them. So in the case where you might have had bail or been able to go home, now you're going to be sent to immigration detention, right? So what does this mean for certain people? You know, we're advising public defenders, if you have a non-citizen with a detainer who's deportable, don't go into detention, you got to go into Rikers, right? So we're put in this position now of telling people, you got to go to Rikers, that's your best option to get out, right? And now, for decades, just kind of back to the point of pre-9/11, for decades, ICE has been at Rikers and jails all across the country, interviewing people to see if they could be deported, right? So if you go to Rikers and say your fingerprint's not there, ICE might find you anyway, okay? So, oops. And then just you kind of get the point. All right, so, you know, when we do this work around policing, you know, just a step back, I think, you know, the big challenge for us is, you know, we've talked a lot about categories of criminalization, a lot, you know, aggravated felonies, and I think that, you know, it's very clear that the categories of criminalization are expanding, right? So it's whether you had a shoplifting penalty prior to 1996 would be a misdemeanor. It still is a misdemeanor to most people, but if you're a non-citizen, it's an aggravated felony. Like, this is the kind of thing that we're dealing with. With the deferred action for childhood arrivals, everyone heard of that, right? So instead of the DREAM Act, you get this thing to apply for a 2-year work permit. And within that, you can see that they've also created a new category called a serious misdemeanor. Now, this is not anything that's like analogous to something in the penal code. It's something that ICE has determined that if you have that, we don't want you to stay here. And I think the real challenging thing is since 1996, since they took away the ability of judges to review most of the cases, now you have this tremendous number of people, 400,000 a year, who, if they want to fight their deportation, usually have to ask an ICE officer to review their case, right? So this is where, like, there's a power shifting now into this tremendous agency, which not only has no accountability, but it has a very dangerous and difficult mission to confront. And so just kind of an example of how we fought against secure communities in New York. How much time? Oh, okay. I just want to say that, you know, the way that we do our work here is we are very careful when we talk about people with convictions that we think it's really messed up that they are expanding the category of convictions. You know, Obama has prosecuted more people for illegal reentry than Bush did in his 2 terms, right? That's wrong. But we also feel like we are protecting the people who are convicted of more serious crime, because we are not, you know, in the position to say that if there's a criminal justice system that's already messed up and you've served your time, then you should be also subject to permanent exile. And so that's something that we're working on here. And then the other thing that we feel really strongly about is, I mean, it's a real challenge because right now the framework, you know, back in the 1890s, it was like the Chinese were problematic, or the Mexicans in the 30s, and now we live in the era of the rule of law, right? And so we're talking about comprehensive immigration reform, the 3-legged stool they call it. Sorry, this is a very goofy graphic. But what they say here is we're not going to get anywhere to legalization until we close the border. We seal the border, right? So what does that mean? It means in order, and at this point, at this stage in Obama's administration, he has deported so many people. He has expanded so many laws. Like, where's the carrot now? I mean, the sticks are only just going to keep getting worse. And so, you know, I just wanted to show as an example of when somebody asked Romney at the debate, like, what about people without green cards? What's their chances? And this is Obama's response, right? We're a nation of laws. Right? We're not going to go after criminals and gangbangers and people who aren't here hurting the community. And so that's just to kind of reinforce, I think, a point that's probably pretty obvious by now that I've been making. But I think that the real challenge that we face as organizers at this moment under a Democratic leadership is that the consensus is way on the side that there's no room for criminals here in this country if you know, weren't born here or you weren't able to naturalize. And so this is what we're fighting for, is the full rights of all immigrants, and just to say that we see it very much linked to the fight of all people, because part of the damage that happens when you, obviously the damage that happens when you marginalize criminals is, and protect the rights of these so-called good immigrants, is anybody with a conviction gets further marginalized. So that's it, sorry. Oh, can I just add one last thing? I'm sorry. This is really short, because I think we can't accept this situation as it is, and I just got to say this. And I was just reading about what the U.S. government did to Haiti after the last earthquake, where 250,000 people died and 1.2 million people were homeless. Does anyone know what the U.S. government did? Huh? No, well, they had the Coast Guard surround the coast, saying you're not leaving, and they had an airplane with the U.S. ambassador to Haiti's voice recorded saying, don't even think of leaving, because we're not going to accept you in the United States. So, I mean, there's a level of callousness and cruelty that we think of Haiti as the perfect example of U.S. empire, right? And so I'm interested in engaging, like, where do we go from here? Not to just leave it with a dire situation, but, 4 years ago, well, when Obama first became president, I thought, okay, maybe something will shift, right? And now we're into Obama's second term, and it's gotten worse. And so, I'm looking for the inspiration and from people who are fighting on the front lines to help figure out, like, where do we go from here? Thank you.
Good afternoon. How are you all holding up? Okay, can you hear me in the back? All right, I'm Christina Heatherton. I'm so pleased to be here today. I've been so excited. I'm so excited to be a part of this conference, and I've been so excited to see how it's unfolding. I'm on a panel with some heavy hitters. There's some heavy hitters to come, so I'm going to take the best advice I was ever given when speaking publicly, and that is be brief, baby, be brief. But first, I'd just like to tell you a story. Last night, I met a cab driver whose name was Amadou Diallo. And Amadou Diallo, the cab driver, came from the same part of Guinea as the Amadou Diallo that I'm sure you're all oohing about, the 23-year-old man who was killed by 4 plainclothes police officers in the Bronx in 1999. For those of you who don't know, Diallo was shot 41 times after the police thought that he was reaching for a gun, when in actuality he was reaching for his wallet to prove his identification. So the Amadou Diallo that I met last night told me how people in Guinea are still grieving and are still outraged by this shooting. And I just wanted to start this talk remembering Amadou Diallo, who would have been 37 years old this September. I want to remember him and all the other people whose lives have been destroyed by the processes that we are talking about today. And I want us to remember, so this is a really good segue from Mizue's talk, that the consequences of securitization and militarization of policing are decidedly global. What happens at home has consequences for what happens globally, and I think here in New York, we're perhaps more intimately connected to people in places like Guinea, Gaza, Detroit, Skid Row, than we might realize. And how we understand racist processes of criminalization in this country has consequences for the survival of people everywhere. I really hope our discussion today can help us link our struggles globally and expand the way that we imagine a liberation. As W.E.B. Du Bois noted a century ago, we cannot tolerate a notion of freedom that is predicated on the idea that another people should not be free. I'm proud to be on this panel of people dedicated to fighting racism, poverty, and state violence, and I look forward to our discussion that follows. My comments today will be about Los Angeles. I'll echo actually a lot of what both Pete and Mizue said, and the securitization in Los Angeles. But it's fitting that we're here in New York having this discussion, since it's really the relationship between the two places that I want to stress. So even though New York and Los Angeles are major cities that we think we know how to think about, for example, New York has subways, Los Angeles has traffic, New York has the Statue of Liberty, and LA has, well, like, you know, whatever. That's my joke. So thanks. Even though we think we know how to think about these places, we need to consider them in both more moderate and more expansive ways. Both Los Angeles and New York have served as local spaces where experimental new technologies of policing and surveillance have been applied to contained racialized populations. But at the same time, these very technologies, policings, and practices have been exported around the world, making these cities both local sites and global laboratories. What has happened in New York and Los Angeles, and of course in poor regions across the country, but uniquely in these two spaces, has consequences for how the world understands, tolerates, and deploys militarized practices of urban securitization. It was in New York City that both Police Chief William Bratton and the concept of the broken windows theory emerged. It was in Los Angeles where both Bratton and the theory flourished with new intensity. Out of these places has emerged a new normal, the securitization of cities and the militarization of everyday life, whose trends include the use of preemptive policing and surveillance, the networking of local, state, and federal security agencies and information transfer, the production of hostile environments where people remove themselves, self-deport, or are disappeared from, and the increasing use of military technology and tactics on city streets, all in all constituting a militarized target policing of, disproportionately of poor and working class communities of color. What has developed and been refined in New York and Los Angeles has since been exported all over the world, from London, Honduras, Rio de Janeiro, Toronto, Afghanistan, and beyond. So therefore, I want to argue that the securitization practices developed in these cities have daily impacts as well as global consequences that I think we all should be attentive to. I'm really pleased, and I think it's fitting that we're having this discussion and this conference here through the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics, whose founding director was Neil Smith. Neil, in his long career but too short life, wrote extensively about the securitization of cities and did pioneering work to make these processes visible. He describes securitization as part of the material and ideological transformations necessary for the development of neoliberalism. Indeed, as we've heard throughout the day, the past 3 decades has seen the degradation of public infrastructure, everything from library closures, the underfunding of public schools, the elimination of college grants, the neglect of public housing, the under-resourcing of public hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, we've seen the expansion of mechanisms for the attraction, absorption, and accumulation of finance capital. And these have been mutually constitutive developments. But investments, for example, in new technologies have not, as promised, translated into, say, more educational opportunities. Instead, we've seen young people dropping out of school in greater numbers, or if they graduate, ending up in massive debt with fewer job prospects, with more and more of their teachers employed as adjunct lecturers. The growth of neoliberalism has not meant more livable jobs, but the expansion of precariousness, underemployment, and mass unemployment. I feel like I'm preaching to the choir here, but just bear with me. And while much capital has been invested in real estate and new housing developments, we live within the stark contradiction of millions of empty homes and millions of people without housing. Overall, the expectation that the state should provide a minimum level of daily life has been destroyed. And these transitions have required a racist psychological justification, a rearticulation of public goods as entitlements that some people shouldn't be entitled to. Or as conservative commentator Bill O'Reilly more explicitly sneered, the white establishment has been replaced by people who want things. Amidst the highest level of poverty and unemployment since the Great Depression, the racialized poor have been successfully scapegoated as the culprits of economic decline. Racism has authorized cities to invest in security instead of services, and in effect, poverty management has become criminalization. Neil was attuned to how these developments unfolded in New York since the 1980s. He saw how this attitude was animated by a new policing philosophy called the broken windows theory. As most of you know, the term broken windows, the theory, was coined by conservative scholars James Q. Wilson and George Kelling in a 1982 issue of the Atlantic magazine. And the concept is deceivingly simple. To stop major crimes, you must first prevent small signs of disorder from proliferating, such as graffiti, litter, panhandling, public urination, etc. The theory was deployed on its largest scale in New York City during the 1990s when William Bratton, then transit police chief, targeted people who were jumping over subway turnstiles and sleeping on benches as signs of disorder. After issuing a number of citations and increasing arrests, Bratton and the conservative think tank, the Manhattan Institute, declared this philosophy a success, and many media outlets followed suit. New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, who was also working with the Manhattan Institute, appointed Bratton as police commissioner in 1994. Together, they targeted panhandlers and squeegee men and were credited with cleaning up New York City, which is the kind of standard discourse for what's happened to New York City since then. It's been cleaned up. In practice, broken windows constituted an expansion and redefinition of policing capacities. Instead of addressing individual crimes, broken windows gave police new authorization to control and moderate behavior. The period under Giuliani and Chief Bratton produced a model of policing that is translated to police departments around the country. And as a result of his successes, air quotes, in New York, Bratton was appointed chief of police in Los Angeles in 2002. In 2006, Bratton co-authored a piece with George Kelling, the co-author of the Broken Windows Theory. The piece was called Policing Terrorism, which was published in the Manhattan Institute Civic Bulletin. Enlivened with the new authority of counterterrorism, they described their goal of producing a philosophical shift in Los Angeles and throughout the country, very similar to the one that Bratton had inaugurated while chief in New York City. They write, quote, "Instead of merely reacting to individual incidents, the police must proactively solve general problems." They propose to expand the notion of broken windows policing to a form of broken windows counterterrorism. And in Skid Row, as we've heard today, in downtown Los Angeles, home to the city's densest concentration of poverty and the nation's capital of homelessness, which is also disproportionately black, Chief Bratton found a new laboratory for this expanded version of broken windows. And as Pete has described, in 2006, the LAPD and the mayor's office launched the Safer Cities Initiative, a measure that was supposed to fund housing and services, particularly in Skid Row. So I'll just give you a few more details expanding on what Pete said. So of course, instead of building houses, SCI poured millions of dollars into police resources. And just to put this into perspective, the entire city of Los Angeles budget for homeless services is $5.7 million. Got it? $5.7 million. Safer Cities Initiative allocated an extra $6.5 million just to fund police resources. Other official estimates suggest that $12 million was additionally spent on beat cops, narcotics officers, undercover police, and mounted horse officers, tens of thousands more in excessive court fees and incarceration costs. An additional $500,000 in consulting fees was paid to the services of George Kelling, and since then they paid him another couple of $100,000 to continue his consultation, so he's doing okay. So even though Skid Row has had one of the lower crime rates in the city, police gave out citations at 69 times the average rate. So just to give you a sense of what this has meant, the consequences of SCI have been mind-boggling. In the first 3 years of its implementation, the LAPD gave out over 40,000 citations and made over 28,000 arrests. And this is a place home to fewer than 15,000 people. So it's like everybody in this room got arrested 3 times. According to a 2008 UCLA School of Law report, SCI represented one of the most intense concentrations of police resources anywhere, anytime, that saturated Skid Row with, and this is the quote, "the highest sustained concentration of police resources anywhere in the world outside of Baghdad." Some of these arrests were for minor drug possession, which increasingly were prosecuted as sales crimes, and it's worth spelling out what the difference means. Being charged with selling as opposed to possession in Los Angeles disqualifies people from the option of drug treatment. If convicted, people are sentenced to state prison and then upon release are ineligible for federally subsidized housing programs, food stamps, financial aid for college, and their ability to gain legal employment is drastically impaired. So to echo Ruth Wilson Gilmore's oft-quoted definition of racism, these conditions produce the greater potential of premature death. While drug sales constituted some of the arrests, the majority of citations and arrests in Skid Row resulted from more prosaic crimes. As the legal scholar Jeremy Waldron writes about, the very existence of people not tied to property is criminalized. Let me see if I can get through this really quickly. So a lot of the crimes were, a lot of the citations were for jaywalking or blocking the sidewalk, which, for the record, if jaywalking were punishable in a crime, everybody in New York City would be arrested. Since the ticket for jaywalking, is, I'm just gonna have to tell you about this in the Q&A. What I'm trying to get to, though, is that one of the features of SCI is that when people are stopped for crossing the street illegally or blocking traffic or something, their whole record can be pulled up. So people's just daily lives was made intensely vulnerable, and people who have been keeping their eye on places like Arizona, Boston, Chicago understand the illegitimacy of faulty stops and profiling. In other parts of the country, they've called these practices secure communities. In Los Angeles, we call it safer cities. And I think it's really critical to examine these similarities. I'm gonna have to talk very fast to get through my time. In the same 2006 piece, Bratton and Kelling describe why the policing of criminals and undocumented people are critical to the fight against terrorism. They write, I'm gonna quote it at length, "Terrorists, especially foreigners who are in the US illegally, have to live a fugitive lifestyle. That is, they commit crimes not to just carry out an attack, but to simply sustain themselves. They maintain themselves with illegal documents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." In other words, not all illegal immigrants are terrorists, but many terrorists have to live underground like illegal immigrants to get by in the US. So therefore, while they say that not all illegal immigrants are terrorists, they believe the police can and should excessively scrutinize whether or not a person is documented, since undocumented immigrants can often be terrorists. Boy, oh boy, I don't know how I can cut this down, but my point is that sometimes our discussions of immigration control and urban policing are described as discrete issues, but a discussion of Safer Cities Initiative, definitely a longer discussion of Safer Cities Initiative, show that they're part of a continuum of policing sutured together under the rubric of counterterrorism. And if we have time during Q&A, I'd love for us and Pete to say more about that. I just want to say one other thing, and that's the international lessons of this. Kelling and Bratton owe a lot to the Israeli government and talk a lot about the mutual training between the LAPD and the Israeli government. But it's also important to talk not just the lessons that the domestic police forces have learned from abroad, but what kind of success local police enforcement agencies have had in exporting their strategies to other foreign governments around the world. After leaving his post in 2009, Bratton has served in a number of positions, such as an international security consultant courted by the British government, the vice chairman of the Homeland Security Advisory Committee Council, the chairman of Kroll, a major global risk and security solutions company. After the pepper spraying incident against the students holding the Occupy protests at UC Davis, y'all remember that? The UC Regents hired Bratton at $300 an hour to lead an internal investigation. After the uprisings in London, the British government hired him in a similar advisory role. As preparations are underway for the World Cup, the Brazilian government has also sought out Bratton's expertise. What this means is that the more the official rhetoric about broken windows presents itself to be the success it is not, the more that features of American policing will become global phenomenon. And just to conclude, I want to say I'm really glad to be on this panel of organizers who are thinking deeply and critically about the securitization of cities, in particular Pete White, with LA Can. Groups like LA Can demonstrate that it's possible to rehabilitate communities through organizing, through the development of local neighborhood ties. Their grassroots campaigns to contest the Safer Cities Initiative, protect public housing, ensure rent stabilization, prevent gentrification, contest criminalization, and make national and global links have major impacts on policy and redevelopment. And just as importantly, their actions have enabled new ways of thinking. They have defied the broken windows logic that communities can only achieve security through the police. They they offer a radical redefinition of safe communities, one that draws on the legacy of the civil rights and freedom struggles. Their work shows that it is possible to define security in terms of housing, human rights, and dignity instead of securitization, a model I think every city should learn to follow. Thank you.
I'm going to buck the trend and not get up there. All right, hi everybody. My name is Helena Wong. I'm with CAV Organized Asian Communities, and if you are still awake, just wave your hands at me real quick. All right, cool. So really quickly, CAV stands for Committee Against Anti-Asian Violence. We were founded in 1986, primarily as an organization that was doing education and advocacy around hate crimes. And from the very beginning, have done a lot of education work around, in particular, police violence. As I think Ms. Wei had mentioned earlier, immigration policies have changed over the last 20, 30 years, and as immigration policies changed and Asians coming into the United States were tracked into low-wage jobs and living in some of the poorest housing conditions, CAV began to do more community-based organizing work and began to do more leadership development work within the most impacted communities. And so what we found ourselves in the mid-90s experiencing was that a lot of our members were street vendors in Chinatown and were facing severe police harassment, where under Giuliani's quality of life, under the broken windows theory, street vendors were seen as being very dirty, and a lot of the targeting of street vendors were around them dirtying up the streets or blocking traffic, and using those excuses as ways of policing people making a living. We were also seeing from the mid-90s to early 2000s increased gentrification in Chinatown, where people were being kicked out of their homes and new residents were coming in, and the new residents would come into the neighborhood and say, oh, this neighborhood is dirty, and call the cops on the street vendors. And so we see very clearly the link between gentrification and the policing of public space. Around the same time, there was also a growing movement against police violence and police brutality in New York City. There was a coalition called the Coalition Against Police Brutality that really kind of that brought the voices of the family members of people who had been killed by the police to talk about how policing was racist and how it was how criminalizing people was not a solution. And CAV was very much a part of that work, and that was actually the time of the organization. That was the time that I came into the organization as a high school student, kind of just learning about what police violence was like, and not experiencing it myself, but knowing that there was something deeply wrong with society when there were whole groups of people who were racially profiled and who were being killed by the police. I would say that the September 11th had a huge impact on how policing was viewed. We tried to do protests on police violence after September 11th, and were basically booed in the streets. And it was really acceptable, kind of all around, for people to have their civil rights trampled on. This was the period where, since September 11th, where tactics like stop and frisk have increased, and we've seen that it's become more and more acceptable to target certain people, to target like Muslim communities, or to target people who are loitering on the streets, and give them tickets. And so what we've seen in the last, I think a lot of people know about stop and frisk in this room, is that last year over 700,000 people were stop and frisked in New York City. And so kind of on the ground, organizing work on the ground has been challenging, to say the least, around challenging police tactics. in CAV, we've joined a citywide coalition called People's Justice, where we've been doing Know Your Rights trainings in our communities and doing Cop Watch as mechanisms for self-defense. So a lot of the videos that that have kind of gone viral over the past few years have been through Cop Watch trainings that we've done with other organizations. And I think kind of what we're seeing on the ground also is that it's harder and harder to protest. And so when Occupy Wall Street happened, it was really clear that that the police were there to police Occupy Wall Street and to guard the buildings and not necessarily and not protect people, but they were there to protect property. We also see that sorry, I lost my point there. But I think in kind of what in New York City, police force being kind of the size of the 7th largest army, we've seen that the police is very disconnected from our community. And so when we were doing relief work 2 weeks ago, last month in Chinatown around Hurricane Sandy, on the very first day that we were doing relief work, the police came and tried to shut us down. And they said that the reason why they were shutting us down was because we were charging cell phones, and we were going to incite a riot by charging people's cell phones and by providing free food and water. So that's the kind of the how out of touch that they are. At the same time, while they were trying to shut us down, at the police station, there were our signs on their door, and the people at the front desk at the police station were referring people to us, saying, "Oh, you can go here to get your phone charged, and you can go here to get food and water." And so that was the kind of it's really clear that the police are not able to meet people's needs on a very basic level, are scared of people in general, especially poor people and people of color, are scared of a community response to solving our own issues. And so kind of what are the alternatives then? Are that, and what are we doing as a community, right? So there's a number of different things that are happening across the city. Citywide, there's been a growing campaign called Communities United for Police Reform that is calling for greater accountability of the NYPD, and they're trying to pass legislation. But there's also more and more on the street organizing that is happening, when there are instances of murders or violence by the police, that people are actually taking out their cameras and they're watching, and people are protesting and demanding more from the elected officials, but also from each other, and holding the police accountable. I think, and then the two other things I'll say really quickly is that there's been the story that's been going around about how the one police officer who gave boots to the homeless person, and how that's such a great story. And what I was struck by is that story has gone viral because it is so uncommon for the police to treat people like human beings, right? So that's one thing. And then the other thing is something about as an Asian organization, and I think it's ironic that we're up here, right? As an Asians don't experience policing in the same way, but we do experience policing, and I think that a lot of times, a lot of the kind of conversation has been around Black and Latino communities, and I think that that's right. However, there's something to be said about all of our communities being impacted, and all of us, and all of our civil rights and all of our rights being attacked when we only say that this number of people or this group of people is more impacted than others. And so I think that as an Asian organization, it's really important for us to stand up and talk about any instances of police violence that we encounter, and that it's really important for us to be in solidarity with other organizations that have been leading the fight around police violence in New York. And so I'll leave that then for Q&A. Yeah.
thanks to Helena for not forcing me to cut her off. I think we'd like to kind of democratize this a little bit by opening the questions up to the audience. I'm sure that you guys have a lot to say, and we'd like to hear from you. So we welcome, I guess, people to come up to the microphones on either side.
Okay, can I kick it off?
David.
This is not democratizing it. It's sorry. As you may know, there's the interesting example of the city of Baltimore, where the mayor and the city council have instructed the local police force not to ask for identification, and is actually advertising itself as a immigrant-friendly city. It wants new immigrants, it says. So I wonder to what degree it's possible that local initiatives of that kind might actually intervene in this national kind of problem and what it would take to do it. And it would seem to me that this would require considerable organization around anti-police violence. And it might be an interesting theme in the upcoming mayoral election. I don't believe in too much in mayoral politics, but supposing we had a candidate for mayor in this city next year who kind of said, one of my missions is to instruct the New York Police Department not to stop and frisk, not to enforce and collaborate with ICE, because that is in effect what Baltimore is doing. But that leads into another question, which is the political organization around this. I mean, one of the most impressive movements over the last decade was the immigrant rights movement of 2006, which effectively closed down Los Angeles and Chicago, and showed immense, it seems to me, political potential and an immense political power. And I suppose the question is, what happened to it? Why did it disappear? And is there any possibility of resuscitating it?
Why did it disappear? So the first piece of the question is, what are the possibilities for local resistance on the police level around the growing collaboration with ICE? I mean, I think that that's a really important, I mean, I guess there's two things here. One is that we have to be really clear when we talk about immigrants, there are the immigrants that most people who are liberal and are comfortable protecting, which are the undocumented immigrants with no criminal convictions, right? So when the mayor of Baltimore takes that position, it's a position to basically say, I am in support of undocumented people, which is good, and we need that, right? The other group of immigrants are people with status, green cards, visas, refugee status, asylees, who are only deportable if they get a criminal conviction, for which I have not yet met any politician who's willing to stand up and basically say, actually there was one Republican that stood up for a woman with a drug conviction, so I take that back. But, you know, among the Democratic Party, it's something that's extremely difficult for people to do. And so I think that partially that's where it gets very cloudy, because when you hear ICE talk about it, they talk about criminal and illegal aliens. Sometimes they're the same thing, sometimes they're different people. And so that's one piece of it. The other piece that creates a challenge is if the police also said we're going to arrest less people, then I would feel like that's a very positive thing. Because if you're a non-citizen and by the time you get brought into the precinct and you get fingerprinted, then it's kind of out of the police's hands. Now they can then, what happens, ICE will identify you and they could decide whether or not they want to comply with the ICE request to hold you. Now certainly people have done that, right? So in Santa Cruz, the police department says we're not going to necessarily hold people for ICE. In California, there's the Trust Act. We're working on a detainer policy in New York City, but it's very difficult, right? And I think that's all kind of about where does the political will end. The political will usually ends for people who are considered the serious criminals, right? Or the recidivists. And I think that that's the challenge that we face in terms of how far the police can go. And I think that partially, you know, the importance of the state initiatives like Arizona SB 1070 and really pushing the conversation to the right, like that's one thing that was on my chart that I forgot to mention. So you have that force, and then you have the Dreamers, right, the DREAM Act organizers who are very inspirational, right? So they're coming out and basically saying, I'm undocumented and I'm okay with you knowing it. Try to deport me if you want. And so that's really helped push the conversation, but really on the side of if you're undocumented and you're going to college, or you might go into the military and you don't have a conviction. And so I think that this is where we continue to fall short, and it kind of lends into what happened to the movement after 2006. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. It's a very interesting question. In one way, I think people just started getting beat up in a lot of different arenas, right? So it's kind of like the Sensenbrenner bill faded. People kind of went back to organizing their own stuff. Some of it was spontaneous, some of it was organized, you know, and then if you talk to some of the big labor movements, the labor unions here in New York, when we were trying to get them to come out around the Secure Communities fight that we had, you know, a lot of their political capital is invested in comprehensive immigration reform, right? So they're like, well, we expended a lot of capital on the comprehensive immigration reform fight, and now we got to go back to our contracts or building our thing. So that's just my own little view of what happened. I'm interested in, I'm sure people have done very good analyses on this, but I still feel like that's the problem that we face with the mainstream immigrant rights movement, is whether it's the unions or whatever, is they're really upholding, we need legalization for people who are undocumented. There's no question about that, but at what cost? Mm-hmm. And I think that the deal has been made long ago that the cost will be for people with criminal convictions. And now with the expansion of the enforcement apparatus, you know, the reason why ICE pushed this fingerprinting program is because they didn't want to continue to deputize sheriffs like Arpaio, because politically that looks really bad, to say, I'm going to give a police person the authority to be an immigration agent. And so this is what we're seeing now, is a lot of technological fixes, right? This whole collection of biometric data. Mm-hmm. I had the opportunity to meet with ICE a few months ago, and I was like, what are you doing with this information if you decide not to drop a detainer on someone? And they said, well, you know, at some point in time, if they become a priority, like you know, their drunk driver, basically they know where they live now, right? And so I think this is the thing, where it's like a massive info sharing. We got the FBI, the CIA, the Department of Homeland Security, and you know, a police force in New York that stops and arrests a lot of people, right? And so, not to be a downer, I don't know if you have something more upbeat, but I feel like part of the challenge, it's become very routinized and is that a word? Routinized and invisible in a way.
I just wanted to add something really briefly, just from a historical perspective, about the first part of your question, which was about local state, local city initiatives, welcoming immigrants, the question about Baltimore being an immigrant-friendly city, and how do we think about those things. And I just wanted to, I just wanted to say that, you know, during the Depression, thinking about particularly like the immigration of Mexican laborers during the Depression is a really keen way of understanding the kind of uneven and contradictory desires of the state in terms of immigration. You know, so prior to the Depression, there was, of course, like a lot of recruiting of Mexican labor in Mexico. During the Depression, deportation was used as a solution to the economic crisis, but then as a result of mass deportation, you had all these, you know, factory farms suddenly realizing that they had lost all their skilled labor, and so then there were new initiatives to try to compel Mexican labor back into the fields. The point being that, you know, the state always unevenly applies immigration regulations depending on its own needs. So we can think about initiatives of the state as tools, but not as ends to themselves, since they're so subject to change. And so as long as we have a kind of comprehensive idea of, like you said, what our goals are, you know, like how this fits into a revolutionary project, you know, and see that the movements of the state and its initiatives can be a tool by which we can facilitate that, I think we can incorporate those kind of initiatives.
And I'll just add really quickly, I think at the level of mayoral politics, you know, even those local political figures like Christine Quinn, who I think will probably be the next mayor of New York City, who have been, I think, kind of pro-immigrant in one respect, and she was very much in favor of removing ICE from Rikers Island. She's been trenchantly opposed to paid sick days proposals for paid sick days for workers in the city. So, you know, pro-immigrant on the one hand, and then sort of pro-precarious labor on the other. Who I don't know who. We'll go there since David was there first.
Hi, thank you for your wonderful presentation about how we're slipping into a national security state and more is going into policing us than in taking care of us. I wanted to bring up the very blatant economic reality, which is the only jobs that are there are in soldiering and policing people, and young people are looking around. And I mean, you see the people who are so-called illegals, and they're, you know, double-duty dishwashers, car washers, or, you know, hanging out at the hardware store to get, you know, day labor and stuff like that. And then, meanwhile, they're getting abused, and they're getting underpaid, and they're getting deported, and they're getting demonized and criminalized. And what I really wanted to ask is, how is there, I mean, we see that a lot of young minority people in New York are going into the police field because it's open and it offers opportunity for them, and yet they get stiffed and they get trained wrong and fired for weird reasons. And I came to an awareness in '06 at the May Day rally, and I was in San Francisco with one of my kids, that I was feeling like there were too many police there. And, you know, there was a great feeling of solidarity and May Day, and immigrants were out in the street, and yet we were being just sort of teeming with police. And I said to my kid, you know, why are all these cops here? You know, look at them, they have their guns out. And she looked at me and she said, well, they're just people. They're just doing their job. And then she struck up a conversation with a young cop. And, you know, like, I was baffled, like I got a lesson in humanity. But the same thing happened during the Occupy, and I was thinking, wow, you know, like, there's so many cops here. And then, you know, it was like one of those moving demonstrations, and then one of the young cops actually was giving assistance to somebody and directions. And I'm just thinking, is there something that we could do, even though we realize that there's this polarity and they're being set up to, you know, lock us up and to, you know, get stuff on us? Is there a method like sensitivity training or something that we could offer to the powers that be, since they insist on putting all of our tax money into hiring these cops, into how to make them more humane, how to give them the tools to hold back from the stuff that they do to us? And if so, are we going to look into, like, at this conference, are we going to look into that? Because, I mean, I had a supervisor in San Francisco, okay? He was a Green, and his solution to what to do for our community in the Lower Haight was put more cops on the street. It's like, why am I Green, you know? I didn't think that was necessarily, you know, the bright idea of the day. He's since become sheriff, and he's been canned for manhandling his wife, so I don't know. But my question was, you know, how do we get in that pivotal point where we can turn these people around and draw a wide circle that includes them? Thank you.
So for us, a couple of comments and answers to the question. So the first thing that we believe is imperative is to redefine public safety. And so we need to define safety in our terms. Currently, when we talk about this idea of public safety, it's from the other side's narrative. More jail cells, more boots, more batons, more coordination with the federal government to get more resources down to the local station. It's also very interesting, and I'm sure this is definitely the same in New York and other cities, is that the police department is always the only recession and depression-proof department in the city. And so it's interesting in Los Angeles, when you look at public safety, the amount of money that's spent in our general fund to public safety. 70% of the general fund budget goes towards public safety, with 58% of that going to the police department. Now, resources aren't infinite. And so if you think about 58% of the resources of a police department going somewhere, and at the same time, parks being closed, teachers being fired, other opportunities in the community, services and things of that nature being shut down, at some point you begin to realize that there's a real dysfunctional thing taking place. And so for us, it starts with redefining public safety, and redefining public safety meaning ensuring appropriate services in the community, ensuring teachers aren't being cut at the expense of maintaining a police force, or even growing a police force under this vantage of public safety that they like to put on us.
Yeah, I think there is no amount of sensitivity training and piecemeal kind of work that's going to make the NYPD more humane. So I'll just start off with that. It seems to me that yes, redefining public safety is one thing, and I think actually we have to put out demands for jobs and demands for strengthening a social safety net that actually makes sense for people, so that we can actually think about a society that doesn't require policing in the way that it's been happening. And so I feel like that's really what's missing, is that there isn't we don't have a counter proposal to policing right now, and that is something that, as organizers, that's what we need to come up with. And then what I forgot to mention earlier is that stop and frisk is just kind of one tactic, and we can deal with that as a tactic, but it doesn't eradicate bad policing and discriminatory behavior. And so we have to actually look at the whole system together. So.
Yeah, a question on policing. Has anyone looked into the idea? I mean, obviously, in terms of dealing with entities of force, which is the police and the military, we only have the power of the people mobilized to generate sufficient laws that can somehow restrain them. I'm wondering if the idea of lifting the sovereign immunity of police so that they can be sued, because one of the reasons that they're so prone to beat people up is because they can, like, sue me, go ahead. They have a fund that pays for that. But if they could be personally sued, they might think twice about what they're doing, and what covers them is what's referred to as sovereign immunity on the part of the police. So we need to figure out ways in which to get rid of that. And more broadly speaking, when you're talking about ICE and so forth, really what we're talking about is the general question of the militarization of the police. And the Posse Comitatus Act, which is a federal statute that limits the role of the military in terms of domestic law enforcement, what we've experienced is a symbiosis, a growing symbiosis between the police and the military function in this country. And one of the things we need to do is to reinforce the separation, so that recodification of Posse Comitatus-like laws on the local level might help to do that. So how do we do that? One way that we might consider is through ballot initiatives, where in New York City, we could mount a campaign and get it on the ballot, so that people could vote, for instance, on the lifting of sovereign immunity, could vote on police should not enforce the stop and frisk, whatever. I mean, the kind of campaign that would be, palatable and winnable, but put forward through ballot initiatives, and which can actually be a way of the people creating laws that we can use to rein in these entities of force, because in the end, that's all we have. Given that we're not, we're not prone or morally committed to armed confrontation with these folks.
Some experiences from the ground. So in Los Angeles, there was an attempt in the mid-'80s by the Coalition Against Police Abuse, Michael Zinzin, to run a charter reform campaign. I think it's important for folks to note when we're talking about ballot initiatives and measures, we are definitely talking about deep-pocketed resources and finding the resources to collect the signatures and to mount those campaigns. And if those resources manifest themselves, I'm sure you would find that many organizations within cities all across the United States would go ahead and take those resources to mount those campaigns, one. I think the other thing that we do at the local level, we have a SEI committee that is the community's police advisory board, because we're very clear that the civilian element of the police department is corrupted. It's, whose members are selected by the mayors. There's 5 board of commissioners, all selected by the mayors, and all that come out of the development community. Very interesting. And they always reserve 1 seat for civil rights organizations who have sort of went right of center. What we have done by way of policy is attempted to reform some of the policies within the police department. We are very clear that we don't believe we are dealing with rotten apples. We're dealing with rotten orchards. We're dealing with corrupt institutions that have gotten to be brought down. The other thing, last 2 points, it's very interesting. Chief Bratton, he was being interviewed about sort of policing in the United States, and he had this to say, and I'm paraphrasing, of course. He said the police department, the police forces were brought about, as a result to catching slave catchers. And then he goes on to say, it's not that different now. And so when you have that ingrained mentality that's sort of guiding the movements of the police department, we are very much need to knock down the entire institution. And then lastly, I have to say, that this work is not without risks. And so as part of our police work, we have community watch teams where we are going out, we are patrolling, we are keeping our communities safe against the police department. Of our organizing teams, myself as an organizer have been arrested twice. Just doing the work of monitoring. One of our lead organizers, General Dogon, has faced 2 life sentences twice for doing community work because of his past. I'm going to say that again. A human rights defender monitoring the police has faced life charges twice on 2 different occasions for doing that work. We actually filed a complaint with the United Nations, and last year it was one of 2 complaints that they investigated. One was the Occupy movement in the United States, and the other was the police department, the LAPD's attack on community organizers defending their rights against the police. And then lastly, we are glad to say we got General Dogon out of those 2 life sentences. I don't know if you hear me or feel me, 2 life sentences for doing this work. We now have another Sister Deborah Burton. She's 60 years old, who is now facing aggravated, and she's also a community watch leader, who is facing aggravated assault charges for blowing an air horn above her head. And so when I say this work does not go without risk, they are going in, they are plucking out those who would dare defy their rule of law, their rule of safety. But from our vantage, our rule of law and rule of safety is very different than theirs.
Michelle?
Just really excellent talks from all of you all, and thank you so much for sharing this. So I was wondering if any of you could talk more about the interests at play, particularly sort of economic interests. It seems like a lot of these talks have centered around the implementation, the development and implementation of new policies around expanding and intensifying police control and deportations of immigrants. And I don't actually know the answer to this question. Who's driving those policies? Like, who actually has to gain from them that has, like, the power to get them implemented? And who really cares about them? And sort of what's operating around getting them implemented in terms of the underlying interests at play?
First of all, I want to just add an addendum to my last thing. I don't want to sound like a. We do organize to get mayors to have the police not police their communities for immigrants. We are trying to get ICE out of our NYPD and Rikers. So I just wanted to be clear that it is something that we're working on. We're supporting other people doing that nationally. It's just this dilemma always with the criminal alien, that so-called criminal alien that we face. That's a really great question in terms of the economics driving the deportation and expulsion regime, because it's very complicated. And I think much like the prison industrial complex, you can point to people who are profiting, but to say that those are the people then driving the system, and Ruthie Gilmore has done a great job of explaining this, is that if those corporations aren't making a profit, they're still going to detain people somehow, right? So I think, the whole thing that we have to challenge with the immigration regime is there's a real nation-statism, right? Which is related to capitalism, and it's very much related to racism. But it's not any one of those separately. So like to say this point, I think the example that you raised about the Mexican deportation in the 1930s, it was fairly clear cut, like you said. They forcibly removed all these people, and then they said, oh, we need them back, and we have a bracero program. And now we're at a point where there's plenty of workers, right? So they're saying, let's give a path to legalization to those people who play by our rules, and we'll continue to expel those people when they stop playing by our rules. And so I think, and this is part of the point that I forgot to raise in my talk, or I didn't have time, is I think part of our challenge is that there's a basic assumption that there's a broken immigration system that we need to fix. And my point is, it's not broken, it's working for certain people, right? So who's it working for? It's working for the government, and it's working for corporations to the extent that they can exploit people without status, right? And then we all hear the story of when the labor union starts to organize and the workers aren't documented, they get reported to, not INS, to ICE, right? And so I think this is the dynamic that, a lot of times when Prop 187 in California, the Save Our State initiative came out, a lot of people thought it was the corporations backing it, right? So, Pete Wilson jumped on the bandwagon, but if you looked at where the money was from or where the political power was from, there's a very strong right-wing xenophobic movement coming out of, I can't remember what, San Fernando Valley or something like that. Was it? Orange County, right? And so these are people who kind of latched on to kind of the war on crime, the war on terror that started way back in the 80s and basically said, these are the people that we need to get rid of, right? So all these things that we talk about, these are your terrorists, these are your criminals, and they're never going to be American, all that stuff. And so, I think it's a really complicated interplay of forces. Clearly, some people are making a lot of money off of this exploitation. A lot of people talk about how the detention boom for immigrant detention has really saved private prison corporations. But, a lot of people are housed in jails too, right? So in county jails and all that stuff. So I feel like part of it is the assumption that there are certain people that do not belong here is what we have to challenge first and foremost. And until we get there, then we're not going to be able to unlock all these oppressions. So if that makes any sense, I hope it does, because I've talked a lot.
Yeah, I think just in terms of kind of the economic aspect of it, I mean, New York City is very clearly a neoliberal city that's been facilitating capitalism, and so it's very much in the interest of governing, of whoever is in government to maintain that. And so then for example, when Occupy Wall Street was in the Zuccotti Park area, Chase donated money to the NYPD and it was a gift, right, to the NYPD, but it was really clear that it was to secure that area. And it's very much in Bloomberg's interest to maintain a city that is that can continue to make money for the city, right? And so to me, that link is very much connected, and there is no kind of separating out.
I just wanted to add really quickly that when people ask who benefits, who profits, like the typical answer is you think about the acronym FIRE, finance, insurance, and real estate. But I want to add security to that, and I think that was a kind of commonality on the panel. But I want to be explicit that when we talk about security, it's not necessarily a private industry that's profiting. I think following Ruth Gilmore's work, we have to think about security as an expanded state capacity. So who benefits, who profits is the legitimacy of a state capacity that turns to criminalization, the expansion of public prisons, the movement of resources from public goods to punishment. That's what profits, right? And the more that gets entrenched, the more that builds, the more that becomes common sense, the more we lose. So not to be too abstract, but that's who profits, that's who benefits.
Can I
I just want to add one thing? Sorry, I can't stop talking. I think that the one thing, too, when we talk about how does the state profit, that I touched on a little bit, is kind of the whole international agenda of the U.S. government. So to the extent that they can convince people that there's a real threat here in this country, then it seems very natural that they're fingerprinting everybody they can encounter in Afghanistan, right? And that they have military there, and that we have a war there, right? Or that they're, further impoverishing Haiti and then, keeping people there. And so I think that part of this, part of this whole security state and this, it just really reinforces the U.S. empire, right? And so this is the hard thing to pin down, like who's benefiting, and trying to figure out then how then do we stop that ball from rolling.
Looks like there are no further questions. So thank you guys for attending, and thanks to our panelists.